I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. One was London by William Blake, and it was written in 1794. It focuses on life in London at that point in time, and it just sort of hyper focuses on how bleak and dark that really was. The overall theme is just the darkness and bleakness of that city. He really berates you with just the dark imagery and how sad it is, and just the cycle of sadness throughout the poem. And in order to really understand the poem, the most important thing to understand is how London really was at that time. So before we do anything else about discussing Blake or the poem, I think we should really get some historical context on London then. Particularly difficult place to live at that point in time due to multiple reasons. The largest one being the Industrial Revolution, which was when people were moving in from the country to the city because of factory jobs. This was great, except for it was really difficult for London to accommodate all the people that were moving in. They had a massive growth in population at that point in time, and about 100 years before, in 1665, they had something called the Great Fire, where 85% of the city was destroyed, and they didn't rebuild well afterwards. So they were trying to get this large growth in population into facilities that weren't that well set up. So people were living in the streets, people were living underground, people were living under bridges, and people were living in like these subdivided shack things that just generally weren't great places to live. And it was very overcrowded and dirty. It was just a fairly unfortunate place to live overall. The place that they were getting their water was from the Thames, and that was also where they were putting their waste. It was just overall very dirty, very dark. There was quite a bit of crime, just quite a bit of prostitution, quite a bit of illness. Because people were living in such close quarters, illness was spread around horribly. Blake, who was born in London, who came from a common background, unlike many other poets at the time, wrote this poem to express to people who were wealthier and able to not be part of this area of London and able to kind of escape this, just how bad the situation was, and hopefully get them to care. As you read the poem, you really feel what the narrator is feeling. You really experience it, and I think that's part of what's so special about it for us to be able to read it, is that we can really kind of get that historical context in a different way than we are otherwise able to. But for them, it was just a way to try to get them to have a wake-up call. Interestingly, this was actually published in a book of children, in a sort of children's book that he wrote called The Songs of Innocence and Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. And I think as you listen to the poem a few times, you can sort of notice that it has a sort of nursery rhyme feel to it. I think that's very interesting for a few reasons, one of them being like the sort of contrary nature of very dark and depressing themes with what we generally associate with happiness and joy and innocence. And also, I think that probably part of it was that it made it kind of fly under the radar for some people and made it more accessible. Blake was not a particularly popular poet at the point in time that he was writing his poetry. He was actually a fairly famous painter, and notably his paintings, he actually has an illustration for this poem that was in the book with it, probably because it was a children's book. And it kind of gives you just more of an idea of the painting a picture that he does with this poem. This poem really just gives you great imagery. It just gives you a great idea of what it was like, and you really feel like you're in that situation, like you're in that world for just the few stanzas that we're reading it. So I think when you're first getting used to reading poetry, oftentimes the most difficult step is just understanding what's being said and like really comprehending what you're reading. So we're going to just break it down. So the first stanza is, I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. So that first line is just talking about how he's walking through and how the streets are owned by someone, probably different companies. I'm not really sure how that specifically means for the time, but just I think it's trying to convey how just little ownership people have of their city. Near where the chartered Thameses flow. That's just talking about how something that should be public has now become so private, and just controlled by whomever. And mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe, and how he's seeing as he's walking by these people just how weak and sad they look. Woe means sadness. And every cry of every man, and every infant's cry of fear, and every voice and every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. So, in every cry of every man, so in every crying out he hears of a man, that's pretty self-explanatory. In every infant's cry of fear, also pretty self-explanatory. In every voice and every ban, so in every voice, that's self-explanatory, but in every ban, that's so like every new law is coming up. So at that point in time, a lot of new rules were coming up, and they were being enforced differently than they had been in the past. So there were more regulations coming up, and people felt like some of their freedoms were being taken away. And so that was interesting. The mind forged manacles I hear. So mind forged actually means, so forged means like made. So people are kind of making these manacles for themselves, these sort of prisons for themselves in their own minds, and he's hearing them sort of as he's walking by these people. He in his mind hears them. Now, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So you just hear the chimney sweepers. Often the chimney sweepers were children, and they would quite often die. They were very small, and they were forced to work to help support their families. Every blackening church appalls. I think that's probably calling out some of the issues in some of the churches that were becoming corrupt. And the hapless soldier's sigh, hapless means like unfortunate. So the unfortunate soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So this is just like a interesting use of imagery to kind of convey a message. At that point in time, while all these very poor people are around, you have to remember that there's also a monarchy that's very wealthy, and also just general aristocracy that's very wealthy, and they're kind of just sort of letting all of this happen in the opinion of a lot of people. So he's kind of calling out the monarchy in that line and talking about how they are sort of using the soldiers to an extent, possibly, and I think that's a very interesting use of, I like that line, it's probably one of my favorites. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse. As I said before, prostitution was a big issue, and that was actually a really big problem because it spread quite a bit of illness and disease throughout the cities. Blast the newborn infant's tear. There are more and more kids, some of them being born from prostitution and then can't be cared for, and blights with plagues of marriage hearse. So that's often, the prostitution is also ruining marriages, or people are seeing prostitutes and then are going back and having relations with their spouses and getting them sick as well, and so then more people are dying. There's really just no happiness in this poem. It's just very bleak, very sad. It focuses a lot on, it focuses multiple times on sadness of infants, sadness of children, which is very interesting when you look at the fact that it's written in a manner that is familiar to children. And in the illustration, you can see a man with a child. I think it's just really interesting to take note of how much this poem focuses on kids, and I think you can clearly see that Blake has quite a bit of sympathy for children and quite a bit of sympathy for everyone in general. I think that's part of what makes this poem so very special. I think that's why this poem is so important to read now. It can help us to really just see what the world was like then, but also maybe to help us realize that sometimes we need to step out of our bubbles sometimes and look at what's going on around us in the world outside of our privileges or our worlds. Thank you so much.